because that's basically all they cared. Their whole society was based around tribes. And who you were descended to and who you were related to had to do with who was obliged to protect you, who you owed debts of loyalty to, etc., etc. That's how society was organized. And of course, another thing they loved doing was having battles and fighting and raiding one another, and then writing poetry about how brave they were, about how generous they were, etc., etc. And so they would write poetry about this. So they had poetry and genealogy. So you can see down here that in pre-Islamic Arabia you have genealogy and what they called Ayyam al-Arab, or the battle days of the Arabs. And these are the stories of kind of their poetry about, and their stories about different battles they'd fought against different tribes. Another thing, obviously, that was existing in the time of the Prophet was stories from Jewish lore, from the biblical tradition, from Christians, from Persians, and just from different Arabian religions around the time of the Prophet. So these were all, and the Quran drew on these. When the Quran talks about the story of Moses, when the Quran talks about the story of Noah, it doesn't tell you what happened. It assumes that the audience knows this stuff, because the Arabs at the time of the Prophet knew these stories. So when we look at the beginning of this timeline with the death of the Prophet here we have about 75 of the Hijra calendar. Here's about 150 of the Hijra calendar. Just to let you know, 150 is when Abu Hanifa died. It's also when the famous Ibn Ishaq died, the author of the Sirah that we all know about. So when you get up to about 150, which is 767 of the Common Era, that's when you have people like Abu Hanifa and Ibn Ishaq living. So when Islam began, there was this sort of explosion of intellectual activity amongst the Arabs. And they started taking those traditions they had about poetry and genealogy and developing out of them different sciences of history and genres of historical writing. So you can see here that there's, if I can find the mouse, there we go. These solid lines, these solid lines represent very strong, reliable chains of transmission. So somebody, a companion, told someone from the next generation who told someone from the next generation, and all those people were sort of competent and knowledgeable and had good memories. So, and these dotted lines are less reliable chains of transmission. Maybe there's not even a chain of transmission. Just like when I say, I heard something the other day. Well, who did I hear it from? What's the source? Or, I read something on the internet. These are sort of unreliable chains of transmission, as opposed to, I watched the speaker, the White House spokesman, tell me exactly what President Obama's schedule is going to be. I know that's reliable, right? We know the source. We know the source is knowledgeable. I saw it with my own eyes. So these are kind of the difference in reliability. And both of these types of chains of transmission are actually, we can imagine, they're part of our daily lives, right? We deal with two different types of information all the time in our daily lives. So a lot of information went into what became books of Maghazi, like the Maghazi of a scholar named Musa ibn Uqba, one of the first books of Maghazi. Maghazi are books about the campaigns of the Prophet and the companions, the early Islamic conquests. This is a direct descendant of those battle days of the Arabs. So the pre-Islamic Arabs love to talk about their battles against one another, and the Muslims say, well, now we're Muslims, so let's talk about the battles of the Prophet and the early companions and the early Muslim community. And some of these had, unreliable chains of transmission. Some of them didn't have anything to do with the Prophet. And some of them were really important legal reports. So, how does the Prophet divide up spoils of war? This is a big legal issue. If you go and you capture a Muslim camp, an enemy camp in Central Asia, how do you divide up the spoils of war? You have to go back to the Prophet's precedent to figure that out. The stories about the ansab, or genealogies of the Arabs, also became important. And these were set down in what's known as books of ansab, or genealogy, like the Kitab al-Ansab of Hisham ibn al-Kalbi, who died in about 204 of the Hijri calendar, or 820 of the Common Era. That's the same year that Imam al-Shafi'i died, by the way. So he's a contemporary of Imam al-Shafi'i. These books of ansab were not really important Islamically. They were interesting because the Arabs wanted to know who they were descended from, and they wanted to sort of compete with one another about who had the better descent. They also were important because that's how they divided up the spoils of war from the Islamic conquest, was actually by your genealogy. So if your grandfather became Muslim very early on, you were going to get a big check in the mail every month, basically. And then so these were important also politically, but not really Islamically. They weren't religiously important. Tafsir in the early Islamic period isn't what we think of now. Now when we look at a book of tafsir, the author is going to tell us what the verses mean, what their legal implications are, what their theological implications are. In the early period, tafsir was really just, what does a Quranic word mean? What does a word from the Quran mean? Or, when was this verse revealed? And oftentimes this does not actually come from the Prophet. This comes from companions. This comes from successors, the generation after the companions. So, because it's not from the Prophet, again, the chains of transmissions weren't that strong. Muslim scholars weren't so serious about the chains of transmission because they weren't dealing with the Prophet's words, so they weren't terrified about that sin we talked about earlier of misrepresenting the Prophet. Right? And a famous early tafsir is the tafsir of Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. He died in 150, again, the same year that Abu Hanifa died. But you also have in tafsir very reliable hadiths, right? So when we talk about the first verse of the Quran that was revealed to the Prophet, Surah Al-Alaq, and this is a very reliable story. Right? We all know this is something that is very well established in our religion. And finally, stories about the prophets, Qasas al-Anbiya. Stories about pre-Islamic prophets, Noah, Moses, pre-Islamic Arab prophets like Shu'aib and Saleh, the people of Ad and Thamud. These also are collected into books in the early Islamic period. Some of them come from the Prophet, ﷺ. When the Prophet tells you about Noah or about Hud, right? That's true. If the Prophet says it, we know it's true. And if we have a reliable chain of transmission for it, then we know that the Prophet actually said it. Of course, we also have a lot of stories that come from non-prophetic sources, from early, let's say, Jews and Christians who converted to Islam and who brought with them their traditions into the Islamic tradition. Those are not necessarily reliable, and Muslims shouldn't base their religion on them. So the seerah, when we think about the seerah, takes from the traditions of genealogy. It takes from stories about the battles of the Prophet and the campaigns of the Muslims. It takes from tafsir, because a lot of times seerah will talk about in what context a certain Quranic verse was revealed, or the Prophet was having a certain argument with the Meccans, or having a certain argument with the Jews in Medina, and then this verse was revealed and it answered the question.